She didn't shout. She didn't beg for attention. She simply walked into a Hollywood ballroom with a silver cross, and without saying a word, shook the entire room. What happens when quiet faith meets the loudest stage in America? This wasn't just a moment, it was a movement. And it all started with one woman who refused to bow. If this story moved something in you, don't let it end here. Hit that subscribe button to stay with us. Leave a comment with the word unashamed if you still believe courage has a place in America. And share this with someone who's been told to hide their faith. Because truth spreads when we're not afraid to stand for it.
What would you do if you were told to take off your cross, just to fit in, at a glamorous Hollywood gala? Karoline Leavitt, former White House press secretary, was asked to remove her silver cross necklace moments before stepping on stage. What followed wasn't just bold, it was unforgettable. In a room full of celebrities and cameras, one woman stood firm for faith, truth, and the heart of America. This isn't just a story about politics or showbiz, it's a battle for what still matters in this country. Don't miss a second, this moment could reignite something you thought was lost. It was a warm California evening, the kind that makes the hills around Beverly sparkle just a little longer before dusk. Inside the Beverly Hills Hotel, the Freedom Voices Awards were underway, an elite gala packed wall to wall with the faces that run Hollywood headline cable news and dominate social media feeds. It was a crowd used to applause cameras and curated causes, but that night something different was about to unfold. The spotlight didn't shift, it snapped. Cameras swiveled, phones rose like a wave. Every eye turned toward the grand entrance as Karoline Leavitt stepped onto the red carpet. Her name was already a headline, the youngest White House press secretary in history, a woman unapologetically loyal to her country, her faith, and the Constitution she carried in her purse. But tonight wasn't Washington. It was Hollywood, and everyone knew it. She wore no designer excess, no sequined power statement. Just a navy blue gown, modest, elegant, distinctly out of place among plunging necklines and glittered egos. But that wasn't what stopped the room. It was the silver cross at her neck, small, radiant, and shockingly visible under the lights. At first there was silence, then the whispers. She really wore that, here one young actress muttered, half laughing into her champagne glass. A producer leaned over to a Vanity Fair reporter and whispered bold move, or a baited one. Cameras zoomed in, not just on her face, but directly onto the cross. A sharp-eyed entertainment correspondent from a major network grinned at her cameraman. Get the close-up. This is going viral before dessert. Karoline didn't flinch. She kept walking with measured grace, chin slightly lifted, eyes forward, not defiant, just grounded. As if that cross wasn't a statement at all, but a compass. And that's what unsettled the room most. She wasn't performing. The master of ceremonies, trying to keep the evening light, offered a smile laced with condescension as she passed. Faith makes a red carpet come back, huh? He quipped, just loud enough for the camera boom to pick it up. Laughter bubbled in isolated patches, uncomfortable, strained. But Karoline heard it. Everyone did. She didn't respond. She didn't have to. She walked past a line of photographers, flash bulbs flickering like a strobe. One of them, used to covering celebrities with curated messages, leaned in and asked with mock concern, "Is that cross a fashion choice or a statement?" Without breaking stride, Karoline replied quietly, "It's neither. It's a promise." Then she smiled, and it wasn't the smile of someone seeking likes. It was the kind of smile that says, you can take my photo, but you can't take my piece. Within minutes, images of Karoline flooded social media. Her name trended on X, formerly Twitter, under the tags #SilverCross and #WhoWearsFaith. Commentators on both sides of the aisle began weighing in before the first award was handed out. Progressive accounts mocked her presence. Conservative pages called it a silent stand in enemy territory. The narrative had already split, and she hadn't even spoken a word. Back inside, attendees settled into velvet chairs sipping $1,000 wine, pretending the moment hadn't thrown the rhythm off. But it had. Hollywood wasn't used to sincerity that didn't apologize. In Karoline's presence, her stillness was unsettling. Not loud, not grandiose, just certain. She was set to receive the Generational Impact Award, a title chosen by the board to reflect youth leadership in civic discourse. They hadn't expected her to lean into the faith part of that discourse. They thought she'd show up polished, smiling, maybe a little neutral safe. But she hadn't come to please. She had come to stand. And now whispers turned into strategy. Publicists rushed to prep clients in case they were asked about the girl with the cross. A satirical late-night hosts team scribbled a joke into their monologue for the following night. A young influencer tweeted, "Why does she look like she's about to teach Sunday school instead of take the mic?" But there were others watching who didn't laugh. A camerawoman, maybe in her early 50s, pressed her hand against her chest where a cross used to hang before she'd taken it off for professional neutrality. A waiter paused with a tray of glasses, eyes locked on Karoline as she passed. In that brief second, he remembered his grandmother's rosary still hanging on the wall back home in El Paso. Karoline reached the staging area and took her seat. The award hadn't even been announced yet, but already the tension in the room had shifted. Everyone felt it, even if they couldn't name it. The cross wasn't the loudest thing in the room, but it was the one thing no one could ignore. Backstage at the Beverly Hills Hotel buzzed like a beehive dressed in tuxedos. Stagehands shuffled scripts, makeup artists dabbed, concealer producers whispered into headsets, and camera lights blinked like stars behind velvet drapes. The scent of cologne mingled with the hum of stress and status. Just beyond the curtain, the Freedom Voices Awards continued with polished transitions and hollow applause. But just off stage, under the haze of soft amber light, Karoline Leavitt stood still. She didn't fidget, she didn't scroll her phone. She stood centered, one hand resting lightly on the silver cross at her collarbone, as if steadying herself before a storm. And it was coming. From the left, a familiar figure appeared, confident, relaxed, calculated. Ellen DeGeneres, in a crisp designer suit and white sneakers, approached with the soft swagger of a Hollywood queen who had seen decades of spotlights. In her right hand, she held a glass of sparkling water, condensation dripping onto her palm. In her eyes behind the famous smile was the glint of something sharper. Karoline Ellen said, her voice just above a whisper, "You look lovely tonight." Karoline turned toward her and nodded warmly. "Thank you." Ellen stepped closer, lowering her voice as her smile narrowed. "Just one thing. Are you sure about the cross?" There was a pause. Not long enough to cause a scene, but long enough to feel. "You might be sending a message you don't mean to." Ellen added, casually glancing toward the producers a few feet away. Karoline didn't flinch. She met Ellen's eyes with a calm strength that didn't need to rise in volume to be heard. "Oh, I mean, every bit of it," she replied. Voice clear, even. "Some things you wear because they're true, not because they're trendy." It was a gentle strike, but it landed. Ellen's smile tightened. The sparkle in her tone dimmed just slightly. "Well," she said, tilting her head, "Hollywood's a stage. Just be careful who thinks they're the audience." Karoline offered a quiet, measured smile. "Sometimes the audience isn't who you expect, and sometimes the right people are just waiting for someone to speak." The temperature shifted. Ellen stepped back, her hand still holding the glass lowered. She turned, walking toward the wings, and muttered something under her breath to a nearby producer. A boom mic overhead caught just enough watch her segment. If she gets preachy, cut the music early. The tension once whispered now buzzed through the tech team. One lighting assistant looked up from his cue sheet and exhaled slowly. A camera operator raised his eyebrows but said nothing. The message was clear. Keep the room on script, unless she goes off it. Karoline stood silently, untouched by the exchange. She turned her gaze forward beyond the curtain where the stage lights waited. Her name would be called in just a few minutes. Her award would be handed over the camera, would zoom in, and every word she spoke would be broadcast to millions. But backstage, a battle had already been fought. This wasn't about jewelry. This was about meaning. And for Ellen, a woman who had long curated her image as both kind and cutting, the presence of a silver cross wasn't just a necklace. It was a challenge, one that wouldn't play well with sponsors, stylists, or the progressive elite lining the ballroom. The hallway dimmed slightly as a producer gave the signal. 3 minutes till stage. Karoline was called forward. As she stepped toward the curtain, a stage manager with a clipboard pulled her aside for a final check. You'll walk straight to center mic, cue prompter, on your left. Keep remarks under 90 seconds. And he hesitated, looking at the cross, then added in a half whisper, if they get twitchy, just pivot back to safe ground. Talk about unity. They love unity. Karoline nodded politely, but inside something in her spine straightened. She wasn't here for safe ground. She wasn't here to impress or conform. She wasn't here to whisper niceties to a room built on carefully managed narratives. She was here to speak plainly, calmly, unapologetically. Not about sides, but about truth. The kind that doesn't bend for cameras. As the music swelled and the announcer began her introduction, a young voice reshaping political dialogue across America, Karoline closed her eyes just for a breath, not to rehearse her lines, but to remember the prayer her grandmother once said on nights when the rent was late and hope felt thin. Stand firm, not for applause, but for what's eternal. The curtain opened, the spotlight rose, and Hollywood held its breath. The stage lights flared as the MC's voice echoed through the ballroom. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the recipient of this year's Generational Impact Award, Karoline Leavitt. Applause stirred politely, more out of obligation than admiration. A few scattered cheers came from the back, likely from guests who had read about her, but didn't know quite what to expect. The rest they waited with curiosity or quiet suspicion. Karoline stepped out from behind the curtain, calm and composed. No sweeping gown, no designer jewels. Just the same navy dress, her hair neatly tucked behind her ears and around her neck. That silver cross still gleaming, still unapologetically present. As she approached center stage, the cameras zoomed in tighter than before. Not on her face, on the cross. A crisp, high-definition close-up broadcast to every screen in the room, and soon across the country. She reached the microphone, her heels clicked lightly against the polished wood floor. The room dimmed slightly, the spotlight narrowed, and for a moment, everything else faded except the cross catching the light. That's when it happened. From the far left of the audience, a light laugh escaped someone's lips. It was the kind of laugh that isn't loud, but meant to be heard. The camera panned subtly and caught at a well-known actress in her 50s, arms crossed, lips curled into a half smirk. Next to her, a younger actor leaned over, whispering something as he rolled his eyes. But Karoline didn't flinch. She stood still, hands resting gently at the podium. Her posture wasn't defensive, it wasn't performative, it was firm. And then she spoke. Tonight, she began, her voice steady but unmistakably direct. I was told this little silver cross might offend some. She paused, no hesitation, just letting the silence do what applause never could hold the weight of truth. But it's not here to please, she continued. It's here to remind me of who I serve, and who I'm not afraid to stand for. You could feel it, the air shift. It wasn't loud. In fact, it was so quiet you could hear a wine glass being set down near the back. But it wasn't the silence of discomfort. It was the kind that comes just before something important lands. Then came a single clap. From the third row, slightly right of center, a woman in her 60s dressed in a dark green blouse began clapping. Not frantically, not theatrically, just steadily, with eyes fixed on Karoline, like she'd waited years to hear someone say exactly that. One clap turned into two. Then another person beside her stood. Then another. The sound swelled, not thunderous, but rising. A wave of unexpected affirmation. One by one, men and women began rising to their feet, not all but enough to break the mold of the moment. These weren't fans, they were people who recognized something rare, a stand not taken for applause, but in spite of it. Karoline didn't smile, didn't bask. She simply nodded once and continued. I didn't come here to be agreeable. I came here to be honest. Because for far too long, faith has been treated like a costume acceptable only if it's quiet hidden or carefully edited to match the room. A murmur ran through the audience. Some shifted in their seats, some leaned in, a few narrowed their eyes, but no one looked away. This cross, she said briefly, touching it. It isn't controversial. What's controversial is that so many people are now afraid to wear theirs in public. What's controversial is that we've come to believe that faith must ask for permission to enter the room. Her voice was calm, but every word struck like a match in a dry field. In the far right corner of the ballroom, a man in a military-style jacket stood up. He looked like someone who didn't quite belong there. No glitter, no PR firm. He removed his cap and placed it over his heart. For a moment, the camera caught him mouthing the words, "Thank you." Back at the podium, Karoline lowered her hands. I'm not asking anyone to agree with me. I'm not asking anyone to believe what I believe. I'm just asking that we stop pretending that conviction is dangerous and that compromise is the only currency that buys you a microphone. Now the applause grew. The room was no longer one room, it had split in two. Some clapped slowly, others stood fully. A handful stayed seated, arms folded, eyes sharp with discomfort. But Karoline remained steady. She wasn't there to win the night. She was there to tell the truth. For some of us, she concluded, this cross isn't decoration, it's declaration. Not of superiority, but of surrender to something greater than ourselves. And I won't remove it, not here, not anywhere. She stepped back from the microphone. No dramatic bow, no call for cheers. The room responded for her. And in the middle of Hollywood, a cross, once mocked under the lights, became the centerpiece of a movement quietly rising. The applause still echoed faintly when a familiar figure took the stage. Ellen DeGeneres emerged from the side curtain with practiced charm, her steps light, her smile gracious, her demeanor wrapped in silk. She waved to the audience as if nothing unusual had just unfolded. But her eyes said something else. Behind the practiced warmth, there was a flicker of calculation, even concern. She stepped up beside Karoline with a microphone in hand, the transition framed as casual, just another host joining a guest for a lighthearted follow-up. But anyone paying attention could feel the shift. The atmosphere turned electric. Two women, two worlds now shared one spotlight. Ellen leaned slightly toward Karoline, voice steady, smile soft. Karoline. She began. Some would say that faith belongs in church, not on this stage. Don't you worry. It divides. The words landed with precision, measured, polite but pointed. You could almost hear the room inhale. The question wasn't off script. It was the script. And everyone knew it. Karoline didn't blink. She didn't shift her stance or glance at the audience for approval. She looked straight at Ellen's voice, even unshaken. What divides, she said, is not the cross. It's the shame you try to put on it. For a split-second time, held its breath. The line cut clean sharper than a rebuke, yet delivered without raised tone or scowl. There was no anger in Karoline's voice, only clarity. The kind of clarity that doesn't demand to be heard. It simply leaves no room for misinterpretation. A moment of stunned silence. And then it happened. A slow, building wave of applause rippled across the room. This wasn't the polite clapping from earlier. This was visceral, raw. People who hadn't stood before now rose from their seats. Hands came together, louder now, sharper. It wasn't about sides anymore. It was about courage. From near the back of the room, a man in a military dress jacket stood up. His posture straight, his eyes steady. He removed his cap and held it to his chest. Then, with the quiet dignity of someone who's buried friends and fought under a flag, now questioned too often, he raised his hand in a slow, solemn military salute, not to a politician, but to a stand taken in truth. Ellen heard the applause, saw the shift. She smiled again, but this one didn't reach her eyes. Her voice remained friendly, but the edge beneath had sharpened. "I understand you're passionate," she said lightly. "But don't you think some people might feel excluded by public displays of faith, especially when connected to politics?" Karoline tilted her head, still calm. "I don't think truth excludes. I think it invites. The problem is some people want truth quiet, because when it speaks clearly, it demands a response." Ellen's grip on the microphone tightened slightly. She shifted tactics. "Okay," she said, keeping her voice smooth. "But you work for a president who, let's just say, isn't exactly known for humility or moral perfection. So when you wear that cross, standing with him, isn't that a contradiction? That jab was meant to land." Ellen knew it. The audience knew it. Her smile sharpened into challenge, as if she'd finally struck at the real point of tension. But Karoline didn't retreat. Her eyes narrowed just a touch, not in anger, but in focus. "I'm not standing for perfection," she answered. "I'm standing for the people forgotten by this room. The workers, the veterans, the single moms, the pastors who've been told to keep quiet. I don't wear this cross to signal virtue. I wear it to stay grounded because in this job, you're tempted every day to serve approval instead of principle." A few gasps, then a burst of spontaneous clapping from the right side of the room. A producer backstage murmured, "We're losing the narrative." Ellen's tone now dipped into something cooler. "But surely you see how bringing faith onto a stage like this, especially tied to conservative politics, risks reinforcing division." Karoline stepped forward slightly, now fully owning the stage. Her voice dropped half a tone, calm but commanding. "What reinforces division," she said, "is the double standard. No one flinches when someone wears a rainbow pin or waves a Ukraine flag on stage. But bring out a cross, and suddenly it's divisive. Why? Because faith, real faith, doesn't just coexist. It confronts. It tells the truth, not to condemn, but to wake people up." Silence. Heavy, tense. The cameras froze. The crew didn't know whether to cut away or zoom in. Karoline went on. "The truth is, I don't need everyone to agree with me. I'm not here to win a popularity contest in Beverly Hills. I'm here to remind people that courage still exists and that it doesn't always look like what you expect. Sometimes it's just a woman in a navy dress refusing to take off her cross." You could hear a pin drop. Ellen lowered her mic. Her face was still, her eyes scanning the audience. She knew. The applause hadn't just shifted. The room had. Her usual edge, the quip, the deflection felt brittle. Karoline nodded slightly and turned to walk back toward her seat. But before she could, a woman from the center of the audience called out, not with sarcasm, not with scorn, but with unmistakable reverence, "Don't stop." Karoline paused. The audience burst into applause again, louder than before, and this time it came with emotion. People clapped, not because they were told to, but because they felt something stir, something old, something quiet, something they hadn't seen in public in a long time. Conviction that stood its ground. Ellen, for the first time in years, had nothing more to say. Karoline didn't smile for the camera. She returned to her seat, cross still glinting under the lights, as if untouched by the spotlight, yet stronger because of it. And in that moment, the battle wasn't between guests or ideologies. It was between fear and truth. And truth, for the first time on that stage, had finally won. The moment Karoline returned to her seat, the energy in the ballroom didn't fall, it rose. There was no music cue, no teleprompter prompt. Just a pause, a kind of sacred stillness rarely felt in a Hollywood venue. The applause hadn't just been for show, it had unlocked something deeper, something raw. And the silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was reverent. Then from the back row, movement. A young woman, barely in her 20s, hair pulled into a simple ponytail, sat alone, hands folded in her lap. She'd been quiet through most of the evening, eyes downcast, her cross-shaped bracelet barely visible beneath the sleeve of her denim jacket. But now tears welled in her eyes. She wiped them quickly, but the emotion overtook her. Shoulders trembling, she brought her hand to her mouth to muffle the sob she could no longer hold in. She wasn't crying from offense. She was crying because, for the first time in a long time, someone had said what she was too afraid to admit she believed. That faith wasn't something to hide. That maybe it was time to stand again. Across the room, a man in his 50s, calloused hands, broad shoulders, wearing a faded factory uniform with his name stitched in red thread, stood slowly. He didn't cheer. He didn't clap. He just stood with both fists clenched at his sides, jaw-tight eyes fixed on Karoline. He nodded once, as if to say, "That's the America I remember." Karoline caught the movement out of the corner of her eye. She gave a barely visible nod back. No smile, no performance. Just mutual understanding, two strangers from different lives sharing one belief in something bigger than both of them. The shift had happened, and Ellen felt it. Still on stage, microphone in hand, she glanced toward her executive producer at stage left. Her eyes weren't angry, they were searching. But the producer didn't move. He only stared back, headset askew, mouth slightly open, unsure if the show had slipped out of their hands or simply grown beyond them. Ellen lowered her mic, turned halfway toward the crowd, then back to Karoline. For the first time in years, she was visibly unsettled. Not embarrassed, not flustered, just still. She opened her mouth to say something, closed it. A few seconds passed, a long beat. Then she took a quiet step back, gave a courteous nod, and didn't speak again. The audience noticed, and that somehow said more than any monologue she could have delivered. A producer backstage whispered into the comms, "We just lost control of the room." But what had really happened was this: the audience had taken it back. A woman near the center leaned over to her husband and whispered, "I haven't seen a moment like this since Reagan." He nodded slowly, squeezing her hand. Others glanced around, not with suspicion, but solidarity. Faces softened. People began to recognize each other, not as strangers, but as Americans who had perhaps been quietly longing for this, for someone to break through the noise without breaking people down. No slogans, no tribal chants, just truth spoken out loud and the quiet courage to let it echo. For years, many in that room had hidden their faith like a fragile secret. Cross necklaces were tucked inside blouses. Bible apps were buried between TikTok and CNN. Convictions were softened, edited, or avoided altogether. But Karoline had just stood before the whole country and said without flinching, "I'm not ashamed." And because she said it, others began to feel less ashamed too. The shift wasn't just political, it was generational, emotional, cultural. A man in his 70s, near the far right wing, leaned on his cane and muttered to no one in particular, "That girl's got more backbone than half the men on the Hill." A young production assistant, barely old enough to rent a car, quietly pulled out a cross necklace from his shirt and looked at it like he was seeing it for the first time in years. Meanwhile, backstage staff scrambled to recover the script. The show was still live. The next presenter was due in 60 seconds. A stagehand called into the headset, "Do we cut the segment short or write it out?" The answer came not from a producer, but from the crowd. Because before anyone could cue the next act, someone in the middle section stood up. Then someone else. Then a small group, then a wave. They weren't protesting, they weren't chanting, they were just standing quietly, firmly united. Not because Karoline told them to. She hadn't asked for it. They stood because something inside them had finally been given permission to rise. And Ellen, still holding her microphone, slowly looked out at her room, and realized something she hadn't felt in years. She was no longer the one being listened to. And yet, she didn't seem bitter, just humbled. She stepped back, slowly exited stage left, and let the room breathe without her. Karoline remained seated. She didn't turn to the crowd. She didn't raise her hand or signal thanks. She simply lowered her head for a moment, touched the cross at her chest, and whispered something no one could hear, but they didn't need to. because in that moment, everyone already knew. Something had changed. And nothing, no applause, no camera angle, no social media reaction could undo what had just taken root in the heart of that room. The stage lights had dimmed. The crowd's standing ovation had faded into quiet conversation and shifting footsteps. Somewhere in the ballroom, applause still lingered like perfume. But in the narrow corridors of the Beverly Hills Hotel, down a hallway lined with gold-trimmed mirrors and tired floral carpeting, Ellen, DeGeneres, sat alone. Her dressing room door was shut. The lock clicked faintly behind her. She didn't need anyone to follow. Not the assistant with the touch-up powder. Not the publicist checking the online reactions. Not the segment producer asking how to spin it. For the first time in a long time, Ellen didn't want to be managed. She wanted to be still. She sat down in front of the mirror, ring lights overhead casting a soft glow over the dressing table. Her reflection stared back, not the composed face of daytime television, but a woman clearly undone by something unexpected. Something she hadn't planned for, something she hadn't been ready to feel. She slowly began wiping off her makeup layer by layer. The foundation blurred under the tissue. The eyeliner smudged. Her eyes, usually guarded, sparkling with wit, were red around the edges, as if some quiet grief had begun to surface, uninvited. She leaned in toward the mirror, not for vanity, but because she saw something she hadn't seen in years herself. Not the performer, not the icon, just a girl from Louisiana raised by a mother who prayed at the kitchen table, who wore a small silver cross around her neck that never came off, not even when they didn't have money for rent. That memory hit harder than she expected. She opened the drawer beside her. Inside, tucked under a hairbrush and an old set list from last year's taping, was a small, worn object, a thin, leather-bound Bible, creased, cracked, and faded from years of disuse. She hadn't touched it in ages, but she'd never thrown it away. Beside it lay a photo, her mother smiling on the front steps of their childhood home, that same silver cross glinting at her collar. Ellen traced a thumb over the photo. The gesture was unconscious, gentle, like brushing dust off a memory you're afraid will disappear if you look too hard. The room stayed silent, not the silence of defeat, but the kind that makes space for something deeper to rise. Ellen wasn't angry, she wasn't bitter, she was haunted by clarity. Karoline Leavitt's words weren't aggressive, they weren't even loud, but they had landed like truth often does not, with drama but with precision, and that was what Ellen couldn't shake. Karoline hadn't come to fight, she had come to stand, and by doing so, she had exposed something Ellen hadn't wanted to face, a hollow place inside herself where faith used to live. She picked up her phone and opened her messages. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment, then began to type. You didn't just defend faith tonight. You reminded me I used to believe too. She stared at the message. It blinked on the screen, waiting. Send. Her thumb hovered and then paused. She read the message again. The words were real. Too real. She wasn't ready for that. Not tonight. She hit save as draft and locked the screen. She set the phone down slowly. This wasn't about politics. It wasn't about performance. It wasn't even about the audience anymore. Something had shifted inside her, and that shift wasn't something you tweet or post or monetize. It was something you carry quietly, like a question you have avoided for too long. For years, Ellen had built her image on kindness, on laughter, on breaking down barriers through charm, and she had succeeded. But now, as she sat in a quiet dressing room, surrounded by reminders of a world obsessed with spotlight, she had to ask herself, was it real? Or had she left something more important behind to earn that applause? A single tear slipped down her cheek. She didn't brush it away. Her eyes drifted back to the Bible in the drawer. It wasn't glowing. It wasn't magical. But it was still there, like a voice that hadn't spoken in a long time but hadn't stopped waiting either. Somewhere behind the walls, the after-party had begun. Glasses clinked, music played, phones buzzed with headlines. But Ellen stayed in that chair untouched by the noise. For the first time in a long time, she didn't want noise. She wanted to remember. She whispered, not dramatically, not rehearsed. Just honestly, maybe it's time to find out who I really am again. She picked up the old photo of her mother, closed the Bible gently, and placed them side by side on the table. She wasn't ready to send the message to Karoline, but she wasn't ready to delete it either, and that quiet as it was meant something had already begun. By morning, the world had changed. What began as a single speech in a Hollywood ballroom had now ignited a movement across the country. Karoline Leavitt's words, delivered with quiet courage and unwavering conviction, had gone far beyond the velvet chairs and crystal chandeliers of the Freedom Voices Awards. They had reached living rooms, farmhouses, classrooms, and small-town churches, places often overlooked by the media but rich with quiet belief. The clip of her speech, trimmed to just under 2 minutes, was everywhere. On Facebook, it was reposted with captions like, "She said what we've all been thinking." On YouTube, it trended ahead of celebrity interviews and award show highlights. But it was one caption in particular that caught fire. "She didn't just stand for the cross, she stood for all of us." That single sentence, posted by a retired Marine from Pennsylvania, captured what millions felt. Karoline hadn't spoken like a politician. She hadn't thrown insults or played to applause. She had simply refused to be ashamed, and in doing so, reminded others they didn't have to be either. The hashtag Cross of Courage surged across platforms. By noon, it was trending #1 on Twitter. People from all walks of life, blue-collar workers, veterans, nurses, farmers, high school students, posted photos of their own crosses. Some were necklaces, some were bracelets, others were hand-drawn on paper. But each one told a story of a faith that had gone silent for too long. One TikTok video filmed in a quiet bedroom showed a 12-year-old girl holding up a small silver cross necklace. With a shaky voice, she said, "I used to hide this because kids laughed at me. Today, I wore it again, thanks to Karoline." The video had 6 million views by nightfall, and more importantly, tens of thousands of comments, mothers, grandfathers, Sunday school teachers, all echoing the same sentiment. We needed this. Churches across the country responded almost instantly. In Ohio, Pastor Thomas Greer, who had served the same congregation for 38 years, rewrote his Sunday sermon just hours after watching Karoline's speech. Standing behind the pulpit, his voice deep and certain, he quoted her directly, "Faith isn't safe, it's sacred." He paused, then looked out at the pews filled with weathered hands and bowed heads. "We've gotten used to keeping our faith in the margins," he said. "But maybe God's calling us to bring it back to the center, not with anger, but with clarity." The congregation stood to their feet, not in protest, not in politics, but in quiet revival. Elsewhere, the ripple effect continued. In Texas, a school board meeting erupted into spontaneous applause when a father stood up and said, "My daughter was told last year she couldn't wear her cross in gym class. But after what Karoline did, she put it back on today." In Iowa, a high school principal received over 200 emails from parents asking if faith symbols were still allowed under a school policy. In Michigan, a factory supervisor ordered a custom steel plaque for the employee break room. It read, "The cross isn't outdated, it's our foundation." And all across social media, people who had once tucked away their beliefs now spoke out, not to fight, but to stand like Karoline had. Meanwhile, Karoline herself remained quiet. She didn't issue a follow-up statement. She didn't capitalize on the moment. She didn't run to cable news for an exclusive. Instead, she flew back to Washington, D.C., tucked her speech notes in her leather satchel, and went to work because, for her, this wasn't theater. This was testimony. But for Ellen, still in Los Angeles, the noise didn't fade so easily. Her inbox overflowed. Supporters were split. Sponsors were cautious. Critics pounced. But the hardest email to read came from one of her own team, a quiet assistant named Marcy, who had been with her since season 6. It said only this: Karoline didn't just defend her cross. She defended mine too. The one I stopped wearing on set because I thought it would embarrass the brand. Ellen stared at the message for a long time. Then she closed her laptop, because she knew this wasn't just about one speech or one stage. It was about a nation quietly searching for its soul. And somehow, in under 2 minutes, a 27-year-old woman with no entourage, no Hollywood pedigree, and no scriptwriter had helped America remember something it had nearly forgotten. Conviction without cruelty still has power. And when it's carried with humility, not arrogance, it becomes contagious. Back in Washington, far from the stage lights and celebrity cameras, Karoline Leavitt sat alone in her office just before sunrise. The air was still the city, not yet awake. Through the tall windows, the Capitol dome stood quiet under a pale blue sky. It wasn't majestic, it was just steady, much like her. Stacks of policy briefs sat untouched on her desk. Her inbox was full. Staff had texted, reporters had called. But for now, Karoline let it all wait. She wasn't scrolling headlines. She wasn't reading tweets. She was just watching the light rise, her hand resting gently over the silver cross at her collar. She hadn't worn it for attention. She wore it because it was part of her, like breath, like conscience. A piece of her grandmother's memory, a thread from childhood. A vow that didn't need a podium to matter. She looked out the window again, then whispered more to herself than anyone else. I didn't expect a fight, but I didn't fear it either. Because deep down she knew this wasn't about a dress or a stage or a soundbite. It was about the right to be whole, to bring faith and truth and patriotism into public life without apology, to show that wearing a cross didn't mean judging others. It meant remembering who you are and who you answer to. And somehow, by refusing to take it off, she'd given others the courage to put theirs back on. Across the country, that courage hadn't faded. It had grown. Teachers wore crosses back into classrooms. Nurses pinned theirs back on scrub pockets. Grandfathers in small-town diners unbuttoned the top collar again and let their cross necklaces show. The message wasn't loud. It was real, and that's what made it unstoppable. She hadn't called for protests. She hadn't demanded outrage. She just stood quietly, firmly, in a place where people usually fold. And in doing so, she'd reminded a fractured nation that strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just refuses to bow. Outside her office, the city was waking up. The sun was now hitting the flag outside her window, making the stripes shimmer against the white stone. Behind her, a small wooden plaque sat on her shelf, a gift from a veteran's family sent just days after the awards show. It read, "In a world that says, 'Take it off,' she chose to wear it brighter." And beneath it, etched in quiet steel, and somehow we all stood a little taller because of it. She didn't need headlines. She didn't need another speech. The cross still glinted in the morning sun. And it was enough. In a world that often tells us to hide our values to avoid offense, Karoline Leavitt reminded America that truth and faith are not accessories, they're anchors. Her quiet courage on a Hollywood stage wasn't about politics. It was about the freedom to be whole, to carry your beliefs into every part of life, not just behind closed doors. For older Americans, many of whom were raised with prayer at the dinner table and Bibles on the nightstand, her message resonated deeply. You don't age out of conviction. You stand firm in it, especially when the world gets louder. Karoline didn't shout. She simply refused to remove her cross. And in doing so, she awakened something millions had quietly tucked away: dignity without fear. Let this be your reminder. It's never too late to live boldly, to speak kindly, and to stand for what still matters. If her story moved you, leave a comment below. Share your own experience of faith, courage, or quiet resistance. And don't forget to subscribe for more real stories that speak to the heart of America. Your voice matters, especially now.